The Unmarked by Matt Fleagle. Chapter 1. Splitting the Tillberry Trees. The bark running up the Tillberry trees in Greenwich Wood was the color of rust-flecked sand. When split with an axe, the trees smelled like freshly broken earth and orange peel. Among these trees stood Kaleb Dellblood, his tan flesh splattered with the tiny shreds of bark shooting off in all directions. Kaleb took a short break from splitting the Tillberry wood with his crudely made axe in order to catch his breath. He set his splitting axe on the half-cleared stump in front of him and arched his torso backwards, feeling muscles tense up and then unwind as he straightened up again. Some of the sweat around his mouth slipped into his eyes. For a few moments, it stung behind his eyelids. Kaleb picked up the axe again and swung it over his powerful right shoulder. A moment later, his axe came crashing down into the wood of a particularly thick Tillberry tree, which towered far above the forest floor. Chips of wood flew up into the air, then landed in a broad spray all around Kaleb's powerful legs. Taking an axe to ancient trees, this was Kaleb Dellblood's job. Day after day after day, the young man split Tillberry trees for his people, the Dellbloods. He was the only log splitter working actively through the hot summers. And in the colder seasons, only a handful of villagers ever lent Kaleb help, usually as a punishment meted out to them by the town's elders for disorderly behavior. Tillberry wood, as Kaleb's people had discovered long ago, was extraordinarily slow-burning and gave off an intense flame. 1 or 2 logs of Tillberry timber would provide heat to a Glenwood village household for an entire week, and it was Kaleb's job to keep the hundreds of villagers near this forest supplied with fresh firewood year-round. Kaleb Dellblood had etched his axe handle with crudely made drawings since his first days of cutting timber, almost 8 years before. The tedious pastime filled up the lonely nights since his exile from the village. Kaleb laid the axe head carefully against the ground and sucked in a deep breath of the fragrant forest air. Greenwich Wood was a lonely and yet a lovely place. It was full of not only the drooping foliage of Tillberry trees, but a yellowish moss that looked, from a distance, like unbroken blankets of tiny flowers. Greenwich Wood was the kind of place you would love to visit when the streets of your own city felt cramped and grungy. But for Kaleb, each day in Greenwich Wood was darkened by the tall shadow of his permanent exile. Kaleb Dellblood was an unmarked, the only of his generation. The only other living unmarked of Glenwood Village was a woman who had fled the village 25 years before. She had never shown her face in town again. Not one of the townsfolk had ever bumped into her in the dense woods outside the village. Most of Kaleb's people had long presumed her dead. Kaleb sighed and bent down to pick up a small, chipped-off piece of the log he was splitting. It was just then he noticed a long, narrow shadow stretched out beside him. There had been no sound of anyone approaching. Kaleb twirled around, axe in hand, to survey the flower-dotted clearing behind him, but saw no one. Just then, a canopy of the drooping Tillberry trees shivered against a cool wind wafting through the clearing. Kaleb released an anxious breath and slowly rubbed a painful callus along the center of his wide left palm. Then he turned his attention to the work before him. But just as Kaleb fit the axe handle between his 2 hands again, he heard a soft, rustling noise behind him. Hoisting the axe up to his brawny shoulder, Kaleb rotated on his tired feet to get a better view of the silent trees around him. Again, he saw nothing. With an exhausted sigh, Kaleb dropped his axe. He sat down on a thick stump nearby and glanced up at the pale sky. Based on the position of the sun, he judged that he had been splitting wood for 5 hours. Every fiber of his powerful limbs ached in the sweltering heat of the late afternoon. Just then, Another rustling sound to his left caught his attention. Kaleb squinted and raised his hand to shield his eyes from a patch of sunlight torching his bronze-skinned face. Leaning in closer, he studied the small, round bush from which the sound came. A small, ferret-like creature emerged from under the bush. Kaleb blinked hard. His people rarely encountered animals. In fact, so rarely that many of Glenwood's people believed animals had become extinct in their corner of Parasun. What was stranger was that Kaleb immediately recognized this creature as a bando, according to the Dellblood myths read to Kaleb as a child. And this animal, according to the Dellblood histories, was not supposed to exist. Kaleb stood, stone-like, among the scattered wood chips and stared wordlessly at the bando. The small creature edged its way out, gingerly, from under the bush. Its darting eyes glanced around the clearing. Then the bando threw a curious look at Kaleb and his axe. Next, the creature nearly shocked Kaleb out of his skin by opening its tiny mouth and speaking. "Hello, tall one," it said with something much like a smile on its furry face. Kaleb jumped backwards, tightening his fists around the axe as he nearly slipped off the stump. "You speak?" he said in a faint voice. "Well, of course, but not often to men, I must admit," said the creature. Kaleb stared at the tiny creature in disbelief. "I wouldn't like to speak to the wrong man, though. Just so I'm certain, you are Kaleb Dellblood, are you not?" it said. "Well, yes." The tiny beast's whiskers curled up in a curious way as though it were grinning, and it clapped its paws together. "Oh, good, 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 good." Kaleb looked around at the clearing, hoping that a glance at familiar surroundings might shake a heat-induced hallucination from his mind. It was not unheard of for those cutting up Tillberry wood to see and hear strange things, for the scent of the Tillberry trees, when freshly cut, could have a slightly intoxicating effect on a log splitter. Kaleb blinked slowly. When he opened his eyes again, he could see everything around him clearly. He blinked hard 3 or 4 more times, but each time he opened his eyes, the furry creature was still there, crouched on 4 tiny legs among the wood chips that littered the forest floor, still gazing up at him, curiously. The bando took a small step towards Kaleb, blinked rapidly with its little eyes, and wrinkled its small brown nose as if mimicking Caleb's quizzical look. Kaleb looked closely at the bando. The creature was an orangish-red color, with brown highlights in its coat and long streaks of white along its underbelly. Its legs were short and its body lithe. The creature's eyes were a rich, dark color, almost black, but with flecks of purple in them too. "Where do you come from?" Kaleb said. "From Terrashine, of course." "From where?" The bando paused for a moment, then started as if struck with a thought. "It's a bit of a secret where Terrashine is, I suppose. Oh, and I almost forgot the message," it said, lowering its voice as though experiencing a pang of guilt. "I was sent with a very important message for Kaleb Dellblood of Glenwood Village." What message?" Kaleb said. The bando straightened up in as dignified a manner as a rodent might manage. Even leaning up on the edge of his hind paws, the creature was no more than 2.5 feet tall. "I have come, on behalf of the Warden of Terrashine, to invite you to a supper for the Animal Council. It begins tonight, at dusk." "An animal council?" said Kaleb. The log splitter tried to imagine it. Even if there were other animals somewhere in these woods, why should they require a council? Kaleb pictured several creatures like this bando assembled around a large, ornate table, such as his people gathered around to discuss conflicts that arose in the course of their business. "We certainly do," said the bando. "And you, to my best recollection of Terrashine history, would be the first man invited to an animal council in nearly 400 years. Well, that is, other than Fallwrinkle, our warden." Kaleb wiped his eyes as though trying once more to rub this strange vision out of them, and shrugged. Even if what you say is true, why am I being invited? How should I know? Said the bando. I don't know the warden's business. He only told me to come find you, and quite a risk that was, as you humans have a poor record, I regret to say, of showing hospitality to us animals. Kaleb went on staring at the creature with a confounded expression on his face, doing nothing to contradict the bando's bleak impressions of human hospitality. The point is, the creature said, I was told to invite you, Kaleb Dellblood, to our council. Now, will you come? Kaleb said nothing at first. Truthfully, he found it hard to muster a response to the creature's invitation on two distinct counts. First, because of his persistent fascination with this mysterious little beast who shouldn't exist. And secondly, because Kaleb had never been invited to a dinner or a meeting of any sort in his entire life. Say I choose to come to your council, Kaleb began, hardly believing what he found himself saying. Oh, do, please do, said the bando excitedly. Kaleb frowned at him for interrupting, and the animal clamped his snout shut. Say I come. The bando nodded vigorously at this. How would I get there? It's very simple, said the creature. I will meet you right here this very night, just after the sun goes down. I will get you to Terrashine safe and sound, I will. Another rustling noise in the distance startled the animal. In a flash it scampered back under the bush from which it had crawled out moments before. Another young man, much paler and scrawnier than Kaleb, emerged from the dense bushes at the edge of the clearing. Kaleb, you overgrown pest, where are you? He shouted. Kaleb sighed. Over here, Silas. The bando peeked its head out from under the bush once more, startling Kaleb almost as much as the first time it appeared. By the way, my name is Leek, it whispered. It was a pleasure to meet you. The animal disappeared into the bush again. The scrawny boy made his way into the clearing, wiping sweat from his forehead with the back of his freckled hand. There you are, you truffle pill, which it should be pointed out is a nasty insult among Dellbloods. The village is asking why the firewood for tonight's banquet hasn't arrived yet. It's almost time for evening meal, and the preparations for the banquet are to begin any minute. I'm almost done, Kaleb said. He set down his axe and began stacking timber onto a large two-wheeled cart at the edge of the clearing. Silas squinted at him. Lazy, unmarked fool, he muttered, and left. Kaleb shouldered the handles of the timber cart moments later and pulled it on his young rippling shoulders along the half-mile trail that led back toward Glenwood Village, but not before tossing a few glances back at the bush from which Leek, the mythical bando, had appeared.